Today at the shop, we'll be replacing valve cover gaskets on a Dodge Grand Caravan. First step is to remove the air cleaner assembly. Then you need to unclip the radiator hose. And then next would be to remove the mounting brackets on the front of the intake plenum. And there's also a rear mounting bracket that needs to be removed. There are 3 10mm nuts on that bracket. Next, we can remove the intake plenum itself. With 7 8mm bolts. Once those are loose, you can pull that intake plenum off. And you need to go through and carefully disconnect the electrical connectors on the fuel injectors. Be helpful to use a small screwdriver to release the plastic clips on those connectors. You're going to want to go ahead and remove the lower half of the air filter housing. It's one bolt that holds that in place. Take a moment and clean out any leaves or other debris that's in around that manifold. Next, you're going to want to remove the ignition coils. Those each have one bolt holding them in. And then same thing on the rear cylinder head. Next, you're going to need to carefully move the front wiring harness back a little bit. This is in order to have enough clearance to remove that front valve cover. Careful not to do any damage here, but you do need to give yourself a little bit of working room. Okay, then we're going to want to remove the camshaft sensor. These actually go through the valve cover, so they need to be removed. Now we can get down to it. We can remove the bolts for the rear valve cover. Once all those bolts have been removed, take a pry bar or a screwdriver and slowly work that valve cover loose. Oftentimes they're kind of stuck in place, but once that's free, you can remove that valve cover. Okay, now on to the front side. Again, we need to remove the camshaft position sensor. And on the front, we need to go ahead and loosen those front mounting brackets for the intake plenum. And allow them to kind of fall back out of the way. Then we can go ahead and remove the front valve cover mounting bolts. Once that valve cover's off, you need to pull the old gasket off and then install a new gasket. Make sure it's seated fully and pressed into place. And then you want to clean the mounting surface on the cylinder head. And then after that's cleaned up, you want to go ahead and apply a little bit of silicone sealant to where the timing cover mates with the cylinder head. There'll be a small seam there that you'll want to put some silicone on. With that new gasket in place, you can go ahead and reinstall the front valve cover. Making sure that it's lined up. And then go ahead and start the bolts by hand once it's in place. Get them all started just to make sure there's no problems. Okay, now we're on to the rear valve cover. Go ahead and tighten those bolts, and then after those are tight, you can reinstall the ignition coils. And we're going to torque the front valve cover bolts to 8 Newton meters. We can reinstall the front camshaft position sensor. And then carefully go through and connect the electrical connectors for the fuel injectors and the ignition coils. And then go ahead and repeat that on the front. Install the ignition coils. Plug in the connectors. And tighten those ignition coils down. Reinstall the fuel line. Okay, next we're going to install that intake plenum back in place. Start those bolts by hand once they're lined up. You can tighten those to 7 to 9 Newton meters. Once the manifold's down, we can install that rear bracket and connect the electrical connectors. There are several plugs for sensors and for the throttle body. You can tighten up those front mounting brackets, reinstall the air filter housing, and then the air intake hoses, and the job is all done.